Okay, hello, welcome to my podcast. I'm your host, Larry Liu, and today I'm very delighted to be joined by a special guest. It's Karl Widerquist. He's a professor of philosophy at Georgetown University School of Foreign Services in Qatar. And very uniquely, he has two PhDs. We'll talk about that briefly. One in City University of New York in economics, and then the second one in the University of Oxford in political theory. He's also been one of the lead proponents of the universal basic income movement. He's the has been the leader of USBIG, Basic Income Guarantee, and also has also led the Palgrave Macmillan special series on basic income, in which Richard Caputo, and a bunch of other contributors brought out a book recently. With all that said, Karl, welcome to the program. Thank you.
Thanks. Nice introduction. Great to be here. Oh, by
Yeah.
the way, my family says Widerquist rather than Widerquist or Widerquist, but we
Widerquist.
say Widerquist. But it's a foreign name, and that's one of the ways you can anglicize it. But there's many other ways to anglicize it. So some other people that surname pronounce it different.
Yeah, it's just I mean, I grew up in Austria in Germanic territory, and that's how we would have pronounced it. But
yeah.
I mean, it's like if you have the name Stein. I mean, do you say Stein or Stein, right?
Or Stein or Steen. Yeah.
Yeah.
That one gets a lot of points. Luckily, you have a name that's really easy to anglicize. Lou. It's hard to get that wrong.
Yeah. Liu would be with a Germanic tongue, but Liu would be the more common in Anglican territory. Okay, so I thought as a starting point, it's very rare to find somebody who really has two PhDs. I mean, I guess unless you are like a professor in Germany, right? You're supposed to get your PhD and then you become kind of like a lecturer at an institute, and then you write your habilitation, right? And after that, you become a full professor. That's why you would write two PhDs. But in Anglican territory, I would think it's rather rare to have two PhDs. So maybe you can explain a little bit about your career trajectory and what made you do two PhDs.
Sure. I studied economics because I was interested in social justice. What makes a just society, especially in terms of distributive justice? What is a fair way to distribute all the resources we have and all the things we make out of those resources? And so I figured, well, to know that, you've got to know economics, because you got to know what works and what doesn't. But what I found studying economics is that the economic questions about that are not really difficult. Economics is about how the economy works. It's not primarily about what we should make the economy do, just about how it works. And years of study in economics, I found, well, it's actually really easy to eliminate poverty. You can eliminate poverty with a basic income, so no one's poor. And that's one of my primary concerns. I want a society without poverty, and you can do it. It's sustainable. There aren't really big economic questions about it. There's some smaller questions about, well, just how much do people benefit from it, or how much does it cost? These kinds of things, and I was really interested in writing about this issue, and I realized the barriers to it are not economic. It is sustainable. The big thing, it's sustainable, it's affordable, and it will eliminate poverty. That's really easy to show in economics. So I realized I wanted to talk about the big barriers to creating a more just society, which I believe are are ethical barriers. The people believe that things are fine the way they are, that the poor should be poor until they do what the rich tell them to do. And I think that's that is this attitude that we can't tax people who to help other people, and things are things that need to be addressed. And so I realized I can't really do this while I'm trying to build a career as an economist. I've written on some other economic issues, such as public choice issues and things like that. But building a career as an economist and doing this as a sideline didn't seem to be a good thing. So I thought about that, well, I could get another PhD and start over as an academic. I thought that was an outlandish idea. So I thought about it for about 3 years. And then I realized, now this is something I have to do. So I applied only to one school, Oxford, because I said, if I'm getting another PhD, I'm going to go to the top program. So I applied only to Oxford. Luckily, I get in. I don't know what I'd be doing if I didn't get in there. Got into Oxford, got my PhD, and now I'm able to attack these issues as both a political theorist, a normative political theorist, and an economist. And this has proved really worthwhile. There was a time when I thought getting a PhD in economics was a big mistake that I made. But now I have no regrets, because some people will say despite the fact that economists will have, I think the biggest economic problems are solved. Some people will say some really dumb stuff about economics in the debates that I'm in, and I can come back at that. But also, there are these lesser economic questions about basic income that I can address. And as much as I try to get fully into political theory, it's like economics keeps pulling me back. So I wrote an article about, an article about the negative income tax experience of the 70s, almost 15 years ago now. And then people called on me to write other things. Then just recently, a couple of years ago, I wrote an entire book about the problems and pitfalls of running a basic income experiment, because a basic income experiment can't test the biggest questions we want to know about basic income, and it often distracts our attentions to the things the experiment can measure rather than the things that are important about it. So running a good basic income experiment is really difficult. So I'm able to write about this as a sideline to writing about this other stuff. So now I really enjoy being both an economist and a political theorist whose job makes him a professor of philosophy. So I'm sort of in three fields.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things that you hint at is that in economics there's a conservative bias, you might call this, right? There's this, assumption about labor-leisure trade-off, and that people are going to sort of goof off if they get paid for nothing. Why do you think that this would be very persistent, and that economic discipline?
Well, there are some very progressive economists. There's people like Marcia Sen, Stephanie Kelton, Steve Pressman, Romer, very, very big economists. And there have been all throughout history as well, such as people like John Kenneth Galbraith and Tobin, and many others. There have been some, but it's true, they are in the minority. Now, economists they also don't tend to be your ordinary conservative. They tend to be more towards the libertarian end, and somewhere between conservatism and libertarianism, which have a lot in common. They're both very pro-property rights, even if they differ on other things. And the reason for this, I think, is the type of methodology that most economists use, that many other economists, such as from the institutional tradition, have challenged these methodologies that assume that everybody's selfish, everybody's out to get profits, and that regulation is inefficient. Things done collectively tend to be viewed as inefficient, while focusing on this model of the economy called perfect competition, which really isn't a very realistic model of how any market works, but it's used as the benchmark. And in perfect competitive model, if all these 19 assumptions of that model are true, then the market is perfectly efficient, and any deviation from it isn't. But we have these things that economists call externalities that make most markets really inefficient. Also, we have imperfect competition, and those two things, when you relax those two assumptions, you're like, wow, we need a lot of work to make the economy work. And too few economists focus on those two issues and how to fix them.
Yeah, I mean, so the most convincing explanation that I've encountered for this conservative economist bias was in the book by Immanuel Wallerstein and Randy Collins and a few others. It's the Future of Capitalism, Oxford University Press.
Yeah.
And what they argue is that the role of economists is to be a clairvoyant.
Yeah.
To sort of like in the old days, when people were praying to various gods that the harvest would be good, right?
Yeah.
There wouldn't be like a natural catastrophe that will come and destroy it. So you would hire a clairvoyant to perform the right rituals so that everything works out fine. And it seems to be that, in a capitalist economic system, that's also what we need, right? Because there's instability. We've seen with COVID, the whole economy is crashing down, unemployment shooting up, and now we need to have the clairvoyants who are giving us advice on how to improve the economy again, because our livelihoods are so dependent on it, right?
Yeah. Well, of course, the clairvoyant economists are also a minority of economists. Those are mostly business cycle theorists, and those are the economists you see interviewed in popular media or printed in popular media most often. What's going to happen next year in the business cycle? Is it going up? Is it going down? Now, and that's really what most economists are like. Look, here's a problem. What we're dealing with this problem. It's not about what's going to happen next. But those economists, people pay so much attention to them, despite the fact that they have an utterly horrible track record. There's an excellent book that's not entirely about economics. It's really about society in general. It's called The Black Swan. I can't remember the author's name, but just look for The Black Swan.
Nassim Taleb?
That sounds right. Yeah, he's Lebanese. That sounds, yeah. And so you've read the book. So it's a great book about how difficult it is to predict the future, because unexpected things are always happening. Nobody saw COVID coming. I mean, this is the worst pandemic since 1918, and nobody saw it coming. And this has a huge effect on what happens to the economy. Or nobody saw the George Floyd protests coming. Well, maybe somebody saw that. I mean, but because we haven't fixed the problem with police violence, and sooner or later, even more egregious one was gonna be captured on film. Probably somebody out there made that prediction, but nobody knew it was going to happen now. So all these unexpected things happen that change politics and economics and so many things in these big ways that you can't really predict it. And the business cycle is so vulnerable to things like that.
That's very much true. So let's. So before we talk about the books, let's address some of the low-hanging fruit argument, I would say, and with respect to opposition to UBI, right? So the one is morality, right? So you could summarize this as like laziness, the laziness argument, right? So, why wouldn't people just lay down if they were given a UBI? And then sort of the narrow economic argument has to do with inflation. Now, these have been addressed, obviously, by Andrew Yang when he was running for president and on this campaign of UBI. But, you have studied both economics and political theory, so I think you would be the best poised to address these two claims.
Okay, well, let's do them one at a time. Okay, the first one was about laziness. Well, I think that is a really interesting and telling argument against basic income, because whenever, we have a common phrase, which is everyone has their price. Now, when that means anybody who doesn't have a job, for whether they have a basic income or for whatever reason, either they can't get a job or somebody hasn't met their price. If you paid me what Kobe Bryant used to get paid, or whatever LeBron James or somebody gets paid, tomorrow I drop what I was doing. I drop my job as a political theorist at Georgetown, and I'd go join the NBA. I'd do it. Everyone has their price for doing just about anything. And when you have people living off a basic income, that means employers haven't met their price. But we always judge the worker as bad. You're bad. You're lazy. We have lazy workers. Nobody says cheap employers. Why? What we have is a dispute about wages and working conditions whenever there's a job offer that someone doesn't take. But yet, we're always blaming the least advantaged person and deciding with a person with a bunch of privileges. It's never that the employers don't pay enough. It is always that the workers are lazy. That, I think, is really wrong with our society, and it creates the big incentive problem that we have. We have an enormous incentive problem in the country today that basic income fixes, and that is employers don't have an incentive to pay good wages and give good working conditions to most people, and they don't have an incentive to share the benefits of economic growth with most people. There are some rare things, such as TV stars, as basketball players, and some major thing, maybe some doctors and something like that, who have a specific place in the market where they do get good rewards. But for most people, we have very low wages. We have a great deal of poverty among people who work full-time, full year. Still, something like 10% of people who work full-time, full year are still living in poverty. Their children are growing up in poverty because we don't have an incentive to pay them more. We have terrible working conditions at our meatpacking factories. And we've had an economy that has doubled in less than 50 years, doubled in size. But yet, workers for people at the bottom have not gone up at all, and people in the middle have only gone up 1 or 2% because employers don't have an incentive to pass on those gains to the workers. They instead have given all those gains mostly to the shareholders, to the top 1%, and to a few top executives who have jobs that are very privileged. So what we need is to change the incentive situation by telling that worker, we don't care if you're lazy, we care if this guy's cheap. And this, if any employer wants you to work, they shouldn't be able to threaten you with starvation and homelessness. They should have to give you a job and at a wage and a working condition that you want to take, even though you're not going to die if you don't take it.
So for you, the objective of a UBI would be to balance the class forces, to use sociological terms here, and it's to overcome the dominance structures of inequality that we have.
That's one of the objectives of it. Also, I just believe it's wrong for anyone to live in poverty. Poverty is lack of access to resources. Resources used to be freely available to everyone. For 200,000 years, you could hunt, gather, fish, farm as you wanted. Then we had the enclosure movement in Europe and the colonial movement elsewhere, and we established this private property rights system where the elite control all the resources and nobody else can get to them until we do what they said. Nobody got a share. I think it is wrong. Not everybody got a share. I think it is wrong to say anybody has to live in poverty. Anybody has to do without access to the resources they need to survive. Even if you give them an option, oh, well, if you tell us what to do, then you'll be able to survive. Even if you give them that option, even if you redressed these other problems in the economy, so you give them that option, it is wrong to deny anyone the resources they need to survive, and that's exactly what we do.
Yeah. And then with respect to funding the UBI program, right? So inflation would usually be used, but I mean, of course, you argued previously that money and cost isn't the major challenge with respect to UBI as a form of social policy. So could you elaborate the sort of economic claims about UBI?
Well, the problem of inflation is the biggest non-issue in the UBI debate. It's the easiest one to solve because basic income is not a special spending. All government spending injects money into the economy. It gives people more money to spend. You buy an aircraft carrier from a defense contractor, and you pump $1 billion into the economy, or several billion. I don't know what an aircraft carrier costs. You give money in a basic income to people. That puts money into the economy, and all money creates inflationary pressure. All money injected into the economy creates inflationary pressure. But all money withdrawn from the economy through taxes and by selling bonds creates deflationary pressure. However, when you sell bonds, taking on debt, you promise to inject more money in the country later. So bonds end up to be deflationary in the present, but inflationary in the future. But now, government spending and government taxation and bonds are not the only things that cause inflationary and deflationary pressure. There are things in the system, what the banks are doing, what loans people are taking out, how much people are spending, and so forth. We got a lot of deflationary pressure when we had this coronavirus lockdown and everybody stayed home. That was huge deflationary pressure. Now, so there's deflation and inflationary pressure in the economy, and we don't have to run a perfectly balanced budget because usually there's more inflationary than deflationary pressure. So we don't have to run a complete balanced budget. But what the government needs to do is balance the inflationary pressure that it's injecting with spending and the deflationary pressure that exists in the economy and that is injecting with its spending. So you have new spending. Well, unless you're in a big recession, then you've got to counteract that inflationary pressure with some new taxes. So you just have some taxes and keep in mind what's the macroeconomic situation. You just finance basic income with some taxes and you can counteract that deflationary pressure. Problem solved. We can certainly afford it. There's lots of evidence out there that it's affordable, so there's no reason you can't counteract any inflationary pressure it might cause. It's not special spending. It's just like any other government spending.
Yeah, I mean, one of the arguments that I have with my neoliberal friends is about the size of the program matters in the eyes of the neoliberals. So, they would prefer a smaller scale, kind of like a negative income tax top-up scheme, which would presumably be cheaper and more cost-effective than sort of like a system where you give everybody that check, right? So what's your take on this debate between negative income tax versus the blank check to everybody?
Negative income tax. So both negative income tax and basic income create a floor under everybody's income. So your income can't below this floor, and they can work with a tax system so that the more you earn privately, the better off you are, because that's good for incentives. So they have this in common. But there's this mistaken belief that the negative income tax the way they work differently. Sorry, I got to back up. They work differently. Basic income creates that floor by giving the money to everybody, whereas negative income tax creates that floor by only giving it to the people who are net recipients, for the people who don't have an income that high already, and then phasing it out for that as their income goes up to get rid of that problem. So it sounds like it should be cheaper, because you only give that to the people who really need it. You're not giving it to all these people who don't need it. But you don't actually save any money by doing that, because the basic this dichotomy between basic income and negative income tax is a bit of a misnomer, because basic income is a negative tax. When you pay the government, that's a tax. When the government pays you without buying anything from it, that is a negative tax. It is a negative tax, and all those net recipients are all those net recipients of basic income are receiving just what they receive under a negative income tax, and all those net contributors, the ones who are paying more, their taxes go up more to finance basic income than they receive in basic income. What they get is on their paycheck every day, they say, your taxes go up by this much, and your negative income tax goes down by that much. So they end up exactly the same. It does not cost net contributors any more to pay taxes for basic income than it does for them to pay taxes for a negative income tax. Their after-tax income is the same, and their what we call marginal tax rates, the amount they get taxed on earning another dollar, is the same. So it has no effect on their incentives. That has no effect what resources are available to net contributors or to net beneficiaries, or what resources are available to the government to use to further other policies. So there's really no reason based on price to prefer means-tested programs. And there are good reasons based on other factors to prefer non-means-tested programs, universal programs, things that go for everybody. Programs that are means tested tend to be stigmatizing. Oh, you get food stamps, you're one of those bad people. Whereas universal programs such as Social Security, oh, you get Social Security, that's great. That's great. You get Social Security, everybody gets that. You work for it all your life, this is great. And so there's this, Social Security does not have any stigma to it because it's nearly universal. Whereas food stamps and other things do because they're not universal. Then there's the issue of needing it at a given moment. Let's say you're a woman with 2 kids and you're married and you don't work outside the home, so you don't make any money, and your husband makes $200,000 a year, so you're very well off. But you find out that he's been abusing the kids. So you take the kids and run to a woman's shelter. You have no money because all the money is his. So you go to the woman's shelter, and then you have to go and call the negative income tax people and say, look, I need my negative income tax. Me and my 2 kids, we don't live with it. And it says, well, look, this says this is your address. You live with this guy, and your income is $200,000 a year. We don't give you anything. How do you prove that you're actually how do you prove that you are eligible for it? Well, a person in that situation who just got to the shelter is in a horrible position to try to prove that they're eligible for anything. And so you slow down and you create more difficulties for the people who need this most whenever you create this. Similarly, say we had any condition will do it. Say we had a non-universal program that we're just going to leave out billionaires. Okay, it's going to be for everybody but billionaires. Well, it's really easy for me to prove I'm not a billionaire because I can afford to have PricewaterhouseCoopers do my taxes. So I have 10 years of records from PricewaterhouseCoopers that I can show. Look, here's my income over the last 10 years. I'm not a billionaire. But a homeless person on the street is is how are they going to prove they're not a billionaire? And often homeless people on the street have issues that make them they have mental or oppositional issues that make them difficult to deal with this. And that brings me to another thing, is that you also have people with invisible invisible mental problems, mental disabilities. So, so somebody who is depressed or suffers from bipolar disorder, they were working now they're not. They're working now they can't. Before they could, now they can't. Or they're on the margin of that. It is very difficult for these people to prove over and over again, oh, well, you were working, now you're not working.
Yeah.
You were eligible for this, not working. So we create enormous hardships for the people who basic income is designed for by going to the negative income tax model. Whereas if we have a basic income, we can say, as Philippe Van Parijs says, we don't give it to everybody because it's good for the billionaire to get it. We give it to everybody because that is better. Using that model of giving it out is better for the people who need it most.
Yeah, and also, I mean, I just can't stomach the billionaire getting the UBI check argument, because there's not a lot of them. I mean, even if they are getting it, it's not going to be a huge fiscal expenditure, and also they're going to be paying the taxes. Back, right?
Yeah. If we have a UBI system that's well financed, then Elon Musk or Jeff Bezos, even richer, Jeff Bezos is going to get at most like $20,000 a year. He's going to get, Elon Musk or Jeff Bezos, who has what, 120 billion at last count, he gets $20,000 a year. What difference does that make to him? But his taxes, I mean, any reasonable way to counteract the inflationary pressure of basic income is going to involve taxing people like people like Jeff Bezos a whole lot. And so his taxes are going to go way up, and that's going to be counteracted. They're just going to go enormously up, and that's going to be counteracted by this tiny basic income, just slightly. It doesn't make any difference.
Yeah. So I heard you in a previous podcast comment on Andrew Yang's proposal of the VAT, and then you said that you were more in favor of like land taxes, natural resources. So could you say a little bit about your reasoning for the tax sources of UBI?
Yeah, well, there's a lot of ways to do it, because any spending creates inflationary pressure, and any taxation creates deflationary pressure. So conceivably, any possible tax can be used to finance basic income. Now, the most common way people talk about is an income tax. And I think an income tax is okay. It's maybe not the best tax. If we had a basic income and it was entirely financed by, say, a flat tax of 40%, which is all you'd need to finance a fairly decent basic income, we'd go to a flat tax of 50%. We'd have really good incentives. You'd still have the same financial incentive to earn another dollar that you did 50 years ago, when our economy was half the size and we could produce half the stuff. So you have the same incentive. You have the same incentive to more as we did 50 years ago. So there were plenty of incentives 50 years ago when our economy couldn't pay you as much. So that would work fine, but there are some things that might be better. One of the things you want to do with a tax is you want to get to the people who make money because they own stuff, rather than the people who make money because they do stuff. And the real rewards in capitalism are for the people who own stuff, not for people who do stuff. We have a saying derived from Piketty, which is Piketty, if you're the French way, yes. Which is the entrepreneur eventually becomes a rentier. Sure, you build a business, great, but you work for your business at first, and then the business buys all these resources, and your property works for you, and it works for your children and your grandchildren and your great-grandchildren. And not all businesses were founded by people with great ideas like Musk and Jobs and Bezos. A lot of them were founded by people who had advantages, or people who did bad things, like owning a plantation where they just took whatever the slaves produced and called it theirs. A lot of people who have wealth descended from things like this. Now, you want to get to those, and income tax does that somewhat, but there are other things that might do it better. Now, one of the things that Scott Santens and Andrew Yang have argued is that a VAT tax gets at those things because 55% of a VAT tax is like a sales tax. I don't want to get into the technical differences. 55% of that comes out of corporate profits, because corporations can't pass on the whole thing to the customers. You think, you have a VAT tax and they just raise the price by the amount of the VAT tax. That's not what they really do. They have to eat some of it because they can't get people to buy it if they just raise the taxes off that. So VAT tax does it to that extent, but you still have that other part of it that is affecting lower income people, and in that sense it is regressive. And I don't want a tax that has these aggressive elements to it. Now, you combine it with a basic income and you take these factors into account, maybe it's not going to be overall regressive, but it introduces this regressive element where low income people have to pay it. So I prefer another policy that's better aimed at those. And one is, as I was saying, people who own stuff is what we want to get at. So one way to do that is with a wealth tax. Now, Scott Santens and Andrew Yang have argued that it's hard to make it workable, but a lot of other good economists like Ed Wolf have argued that there is a way to make it worthwhile. I haven't looked at this issue. I can't prove it either way, but I think there's a lot of promise in the wealth tax. I think the ones we've tried haven't been the best design, and we could try it a different way. But there are other things we can tax, which is the ownership of resources, especially land. I'm sitting here in an apartment on some very valuable land in New Orleans. This is really valuable land. I don't own this yard. That belongs to the whole apartment building. But New Orleans is a place with valuable land, but not valuable land compared to like New York City or London or San Francisco. And this land, we all have to pay for this land, and it goes to the person who owns the land, whether they did anything or not. You buy land or rent land in Hawaii, you're rewarding somebody who stole it from the native Hawaiians. And you do that here, and that's really who you're rewarding it here. It's a little less recent, but in the whole of the United States, you're buying it from somebody who bought it somebody who stole it from the Indians. So what we can do is tax the value of land. And then you create no disincentive, because what you're doing is that you're taking the value of this plot, which nobody invented, nobody created, so there's no disincentive problem here. You're taking that value of that plot and saying, that doesn't go to the owner, that goes to the people as a whole. And then you're saying, if you want value out of your lot, add value to that lot by building a building on it or providing a service on it. And then you can make money off the value add, not just this free rent you're getting by taking resources that don't belong to anybody and saying they're mine and they're not yours, and you can have them unless I get them. So I think land taxes are very good. And in that same category is all resources, whether it's gold mining or whether it's bottled water. All of these things are using resources for the most part, the people who are owning these companies are paying very little to government for the privilege of taking our resources, adding some value to it, and then sending it to everybody else. They should be paying the full resource value. There are many things like that, like pollution. They're using our atmosphere and our rivers as a garbage can, and they're paying usually nothing for it whatsoever. We should be taxing pollution at higher than the profit maximizing rate. That's going to raise a lot of revenue. Also, we can look at things that the government does that are effectively handouts to wealthy people and stop doing it that way, such as the Federal Reserve System, which is really a banker's club that's supported by U.S. tax dollars. It needs to stop being a banker's club where all the members of the Reserve Board are billionaires or centimillionaires. And we need to replace that. We need to replace that with a for-profit Federal Reserve System that returns those profits to the system. And that would take enormous money from the banking system and give it to the people. But it would be, because we're providing a service, it would be money that the government is essentially earning. And then we need to reverse all the giveaways that government give to privileged people. You probably have pennies in your pocket right now. When pennies, you need 50 pennies to buy anything. It doesn't make any sense that we still make pennies when it buys so much less than it did when we made the decision to start making pennies, when you can actually buy things with them.
Yeah.
When you have pennies in your pocket because the people that own the company that makes the penny spend a lot of these campaign contributions. With these bribes that we call campaign contributions. They spread them around Congress, and then everybody in Congress wants to keep buying the pennies, even though the people don't need them. A lot of our defense contracting is buying things that the Pentagon doesn't want, but contractors have bribed the Congress to buy them from them anyway. And there's so many things like this. If you reduce all of these things, we might not need the VAT tax. We probably don't need much more in income tax. I haven't done a full accounting, but if you eliminate these things, you're going to raise billions and billions and maybe trillions of dollars every year.
Yeah, I mean, these are all very good points, but I think the main issue that you are addressing here is this broader question of how to properly regulate society, and the different ways to do that would be by taxation, as you would prefer, and then the other would be by questioning the private property ownership regime, where you might say it would make more sense that maybe the state would run industries or produce some goods and services. But I think in your book in 2013, Freedom to Say No, you talk a little bit about this, you could say, example of capitalism versus communitarianism, and I think in the example that you used, I think it's like the gambling system in Nevada or something like that, where you seem to be critical of both, sort of the capitalist private property as well as communitarian notions. So could you explain that?
Well, it's not just communitarian notions, but it's also socialist, communist notions, welfare state capitalism notions, and capitalist notions. I'm critical of them if they have this one feature. And that feature is, we're going to force people to participate. I'm going to say, if the capitalists own all the resources and you cannot survive unless you go and get a job for a capitalist, then they're forcing you to do their bidding. But if, say, a perfect socialist society that has a perfect democracy, well, democracies let everybody vote. A perfect democracy lets everybody vote, but there's no such thing as unanimous consensus. They have to do it on a vote, and then you get a 51 in a perfect in a perfect socialist system with a perfect democracy, you would have 51% people deciding. And it's very easy for 51% of insiders to control over the 49% of outsiders, or maybe 80% of insiders controlling over the 20% of outsiders. Our democracy has done that as long as it's been a democracy, shutting out blacks and Hispanics and Asians and Native Americans who are treated less, and low-income people. And now that's partly because all of the influence of money in politics that I mentioned before, but it's also because majorities tend to come out of the relatively privileged group. So whatever system you're going to have, from full-on capitalism to full-on socialism, the most important thing is you don't force people to participate. You're going to say, we're going to have a basic income. Everyone is going to have their most basic needs met. Mm-hmm. They've got enough money to command what they need to have them live in dignity and participation in society. We're not going to shut you out, but then we're going to offer you. So then that puts the discipline on us, the relatively privileged group. We're going to put the discipline on ourselves, that we have to pay you enough to make you want to. And that would be such a more humane system, a system where no one is in poverty and no one fears poverty. So I'm more concerned with that than I am with what mix of socialist institutions and capitalist institutions we
have, right? So do you have this big idea that you have in this 2013 book, right? Justice as pursuit of accord, and like independentarianism, and also I think there was another concept, freedom of effective control, self-ownership. Could you unpack this for the non-political theorists in the audience?
Sure. Independentarianism is the name that I give to the ideology that goes along with my political theory. Now, lots of people in political theory make up ideologies. I know the guy who created what he calls real libertarianism. That's Philippe von Parijs. It's much less well known than so-called libertarianism, and I think it is a little more real. Although I don't think it's as, yeah, well, anyway. And then I know the woman who created the ideology of limitarianism. And so I create my own. That's not all political theorists do it, but some of us do. Limitarianism is an idea of a maximum wealth. Now, so I've created this idea of independentarianism, which is the ideology that goes on with my theory of justice as the pursuit of accord. Now, I'll explain what that is later. Now, it takes its name from this idea that we have to get voluntary participation of people. We respect everybody's independence. We've built a society around you, but not every rule in this society is fair. Not all the wages and working conditions are fair. Not even the way we enforce murder is fair. We actually are less likely to convict wealthy people of murder, even when they commit it, than we are of poor people or non-white people. And so all of our rules have embedded in fairness, and we don't know how to eliminate all of them. Sometimes we don't want to, and sometimes we just don't know how, and we create bigger mistakes when we try to solve all of them. So because we can't prove that everything is completely fair, and we all have different opinions on what is fair, we need to respect everybody's independence and to leave them out as much as we can. And I argue to do that with the highest sustainable basic income. Now, the idea of justice as the pursuit of accord is the political theory that is a response to things like John Rawls' justice as fairness, or Robert Nozick's justice as entitlement, and things like social contract theory. Social contract theory is we all sit down and imagine what would be a social arrangement that we could all agree to. And it has to be in everybody's interest.
Mm-hmm.
And then we tell ourselves, well, the society we have is in everybody's interest, so everybody has to participate. And Rawls makes this mistake as well. He uses slightly different reasoning into it, but it's a workers, we all participate in this joint project, and we believe that this would be better than the chaos that would happen if we didn't have some joint project. So we assume everybody agrees. And because you agree, because you theoretically agree, you can't object to the wages and working conditions or the other rules of society and say, I'm going to sit out because of that, because we already, in theory, said you agree. No matter how much you say you don't agree, we're going to say you agree. Because when you don't agree, you're just being unreasonable, because we've already thought this out. Now, that's social contract theory, and that applies to both social contract theory and Rawlsianism.
Mm.
But my argument is we're not infallible like that. And as a matter of fact, the rules are going to be made by the relatively privileged. They suffer from lack of understanding of what it's like to be less privileged, mm-hmm. whether it's by gender or race or class or whatever. They don't understand their situation, so they can't really make rules that are good for them. But also, they often don't have sufficient empathy for them. Mm-hmm. And they have self-serving bias. So they will convince themselves that we have done enough so we can make everybody participate. Now, what I argue is that we will never do enough. There will never be a truly just society. We will always have bias in favor of the privileged. So the privileged need to discipline themselves and say, we're going to respect everybody's independence, mm-hmm. and let them sit out. But also then we got to look at all of our rules are questionable. Every single one of our rules are questionable. And we need, therefore, to try to make these rules in the most democratic way and the most respective of people's independence, in the way that respects most people's independence. And then we need to really rethink how resources become property. Resources have become private property because governments interfered with indigenous peoples all around the world, including in Europe, and mm-hmm. said, these privileged people are going to own stuff and the rest of you are going to work for them. I have an entire book called, co-written with Grant McCall, called The Prehistory of Private Property, and there are plenty of evidence in there that that's just the way the private property system was created. The so-called libertarians have this myth where an appropriator goes into the woods and declares that his property and improves it and everybody benefits from that. Yeah. That is nothing more than a destructive myth. The actual history of property, if governments give it to somebody and make everybody else work for them. Often that's the goal. There are times in history where people have stated that as a goal. Well, we need stronger property rights for the rich so that the poor will work, because otherwise they're too lazy. So what we need to do then is question how property gets to be private. Mm-hmm. And this should be an ideal theory. This would be a negotiation. Well, this person wants to own this land, and that means this person is going to be a non-owner of that land. So they should agree to the price of that land, the rent that this person is going to pay that person mm-hmm. for saying it's mine and not yours. So they should agree to the terms, and they should agree to the price, and they should agree what regulations. Okay, you own this land. Does that mean you can pollute the land? Or what can you do with this land? Does that mean you can put a big noisy thing right next to where I'm renting property or not? You would hopefully negotiate all these things. Yeah. So, but a perfect negotiation is clearly not possible. So instead, you have to have these private property holders or private property holder wannabes negotiating with the government, when the government is not motivated by getting their campaign contributions, but it's motivated by maximizing the true value of the people's endowment in their in all the resources of the earth. Now, and I don't mean just the financial endowment, because maximizing the financial endowment would ignore the value of a clean environment, a healthy and sustainable environment. and the other things that we might like, having nice parks that aren't necessarily ecological parks, but they're nice places to work that might be better as public property. So their goal needs to be to maximize the value of people's endowment, and then therefore not privatize any property unless they at least maximize the revenue they're getting for saying, okay, you pay us this rent, then you can own this property for however many years. Get the maximum rent and put the regulations on that property that are going to make it in everybody else's interest to make this person the owner. But of course, based on what I was saying earlier, they're going to screw that up. They're not going to do that perfectly. And the ways that they're going to do it imperfectly are going to disadvantage the people who are already the most advantaged. So what they have to do, so this is a second reason for basic income. One is nobody should lack the resources they need to survive. Second is nobody should be forced to do anything to get the resources they need to survive. And the third is, when we dole out resources to people, we know we're going to make mistakes that are going to fall hardest on the most disadvantaged people. Therefore, we have to maximize the value of the basic income, the highest sustainable basic income, because to pay people back and to make it really in their interest as much as we can to support this property rights system by maximizing the basic income as high as we can without creating incentive problems that are going to make the environment unsustainable, or that are going to be bad for the people who receive the basic income. So that is justice is the pursuit of accord in a nutshell. I have written. Is this background? No, there's suddenly some new background.
No, don't worry about it. That's fine.
Okay. I have written the first book, which is Freedom as the Power to Say No. That's the first book from 2013. And I've written almost all of my articles tie into this idea in one way or another. But I've written a couple more about the pursuit of accord here and there. But I'm working towards writing a book called Justice as the Pursuit of Accord. That's those two books are the two books that are really going to outline my theory. One is done, one's in the future, but what you have here is justice as the pursuit of accord in a nutshell.
Okay, so there's obviously a lot of directions we could go off onto, but I think you made a good segue to your Prehistory of Private Property book, and you make very heavy reference, as you mentioned earlier, to tribal band societies. So those are, I guess, the foragers, the hunters and gatherers, and so it features very prominently to build your case against the three, as you call it, proprietarian hypothesis, namely about inequality, market freedom, and individual appropriation. So could you tell listeners why anthropological evidence of foraging, hunting societies is so important to build your case?
Sure. I've made a lot of arguments against this ideology that is usually called libertarianism, which is really a bad word for it, because they don't really promote liberty. They promote property rights for the privileged at the expense of liberty for everyone. So I prefer the term proprietarian. Now, some people from this group actually use that term as well, proprietarian, but the more common word is libertarian or right libertarian. This, and the first book, which was called Prehistoric Myths in Modern Political Philosophy. You sure this background noise is not bothering you?
It's fine. I think
all right.
You can just continue.
I'll leave it up to you to say anything if we need to pause for the background noise. The first book was called Prehistoric Myths in Modern Political Philosophy. That it's one that it argues against mainly one thing that these so-called libertarians and social contract theorists tend to share, which is that this belief that we all benefit from society, that the property rights system is good because everybody's better off than we would be if we didn't have a private property rights system. And the social contract idea is that governments are good because everybody would be better off than people were before we had governments, when we had non-state societies. But if you actually look at the anthropology of stateless peoples and the history of the conquest and the conquest of stateless peoples, you find that the least off among us are not any better off. And we go through many ways to make this comparison. And you look also at the evidence that people have given to say that the least off among us are better off than stateless peoples or people in systems that don't have property rights. It's based on the colonial prejudice that it's better to be a civilized man than it is to be a naked savage. And that was never more than a prejudice. Mm-hmm. And you look at the evidence that people have given in the hundreds of years since that was a widely believed idea. You look at, there has been virtually no new evidence put forward. It's really just a prejudice that we've inherited from these people. So that's the point in the first book. The second book is called The Prehistory of Private Property. And in that one, we debunk three claims. This is more propertarian. The first one was mostly social contract theory. The second one is mostly propertarian. These claims are that inequality is impossible, or it's impossible without some sacrifice and freedom, that capitalism promotes negative freedom more than any other system, and third, that there's something natural about private property, that private property owners have a natural right to what they hold, and any government taxation, regulation, or redistribution necessarily interferes with that and creates greater coercion in society. Mm-hmm. All of those three things are false, and we show that with a great deal of evidence. Equality is possible. There have been societies, stateless societies, that have maintained a very high level of equality, and those societies also tend to be very free in this negative sense. There are people in those societies that never have to take an order in their lives, whereas most of us now, we're interfered with the things that people in stateless, nomadic, hunter and gatherer societies could do, that would be free to go and living without being someone else's employee. We've closed off all of those options, and the option to become your own farmer or to start your own business, because all the resources are owned by this group of people. And we interfere with them in a way that puts them in a position where then they have to go and take a job 40 hours a week, 50 weeks a year, for 40 or 50 years of their lives. We put them in a profoundly unfree situation. Yeah. Then, the private property rights system, as I mentioned before, we have chapters and chapters of evidence on this. It did not develop naturally. It developed by taking indigenous peoples throughout the world, including in Europe, interfering with what they're doing and saying, you don't own the land anymore, this Lord owns the land. And if you want to use that land or any of the resources that come from it, you got to work for the Lord. And it was by a 500-year, well, to some extent, this began 5,000 years ago, but it really hadn't only reached so far by about 1500. But then the colonial movement outside Europe and the enclosure movement inside Europe over the past 500 years has, through violence and aggression, has established this private property rights system. There is nothing natural about it. Mm-hmm. People have a natural tendency when they, well, I don't know, it's hard to say what's natural, but it's much more common for people, if they're going into the wilderness and appropriating property together, they'll say, well, you can have this for now, but we got to make sure that everybody who's born in this society gets some access to it later, and then you're not going to use it in a way that is going to interfere with how other people want to use their land. That's taxation, that's regulation, and redistribution in a different form.
Yeah. Let's see whether the clock goes. Okay, we can continue again. So so the proprietarians, I mean, they make this argument that it's not freedom that you should care about, but it's opportunity, right? It's about your ability to earn enough income, and then with that, we have a good regime. The capitalist regime is ultimately a good one, because you get to enjoy the smartphone, you get to enjoy the laptop we are using here, right? And all these products. If we're inside, we have air conditioning now, and that and those affordances, seem to be much better than anything that our hunter-gathering ancestors had. So what would be your reply to that?
Yeah. So this, I think, is this great contradiction behind the proprietarian argument. These so-called libertarians say it's all about liberty. It's about negative liberty. It's about not interfering with people. And look, if you take this property from this person and give it to that person, you're interfering with them. And if you have these regulations on this property owner, you're interfering with those regulations. Now, that's true, you do. But also the thing is, if you take this natural resource like land and water and all the other resources we have, and you say, this is mine and it's not yours, you're interfering with that person. These resources were here before all of us got there. All of us got onto the earth. All these resources were here, and we were free to use them. We were free to use them, but not to own them. It was a commons. And we have, by creating the private property rights system, we have interfered with non-owners in order to free owners from way more interference. They get a sole and despotic dominion over this land. Now, most proprietarians will admit that, yeah, we do. Okay, it interferes with them. But then they will say, but it's okay because there's going to be so many opportunities in the great capitalist system that these people are going to be better off. But that's not freedom. That's not negative freedom. That's not negative liberty. That's opportunity. As Isaiah Berlin says, liberty is liberty, not well-being or opportunity or a clear conscience. Liberty is liberty. So they have this big contradiction, and what it really amounts to is that they care about the liberty of the rich, but not the liberty of the poor. That's not libertarianism, that's proprietarianism. If your basis of your system is opportunity, as it is, that's what justifies the rich taking all the stuff from the poor. Oh, there's some where we don't even have to provide opportunities for them. There's some versions of a libertarianism like that. And then they don't even deliver those opportunities. As we argued in the book, Prehistoric Myths and Modern Political Philosophy, not only does it have opportunity at the heart of the system, but it also doesn't even deliver enough opportunity to make good on its promise that everybody is better off. So I think it is a system. It is a system that has a contradiction at its base. It's supposed to be about liberty, and it isn't. And libertarians consistently, these so-called libertarians, consistently refuse to pay any attention to that. You point that out, and they just simply go, "Well, everybody's better off, so things are fine." And that's one of the reasons I focus so much on criticizing this ideology. Another reason is that it is so popular in the United States and to some extent in other countries. Now, people who self-identify as libertarians are still a fringe group. They only have like one senator and a few others here and there in the United States government. But these particular arguments are usually shared by almost all Republicans, almost all conservatives, and many Democrats, and people who might call themselves liberal as well. These arguments, which the proprietarians outline very clearly, are endorsed by a lot of other people. So I focus on them partly just because they're the ones who really articulate the basis of some things that are widely believed. They have other things that they believe that are a little too radical for everybody else. But this basic idea that property is a natural right, and government, anything government might do, or any demands that the lower class might make is interference. This is property. That's interference. That is.
It's like hegemonic ideology.
Widely shared. Some might say, well, that interference is justified to help those poor people, but it's still interference, and we're sacrificing liberty. Even Isaiah Berlin said that, and he was wrong about that.
Yeah.
So when I'm criticizing libertarians, I'm criticizing people as liberal as Isaiah Berlin.
Yeah. So I totally agree. I mean, so in terms of property rights regimes, I mean, I'm very heavily influenced by Aristotelian thinking because I recall he used to say in the Constitution in Athens that there should be a distinction between legal versus use rights, right? So he's a strong proponent of private property, but he's also in favor of sharing the use rights with your neighbors. So I guess the most simple example is if I have like a bike pump and then my friends want to lend the bike pump for a few minutes and give it back to me at the end. Do you have a position in general regarding the ideal private property arrangements?
Well, yeah, I outlined that in when I was talking about justice as the pursuit of accord, is that it needs to be this imperfect negotiation between the people who want to own and the government who is doling out those private property rights. Thomas Hobbes, who I disagree with on many, many things, was really right about one thing. All property traces back to the arbitrary decision of the sovereign. That is the origin of private property. Now, and lots of evidence for it in our book. Now, but the sovereign should represent the people, and they should have a negotiation. So now, but what comes out of that negotiation, given the caveats I said about you gotta err on the side of giving too much to the least advantage. The outcome of that negotiation is going to be a system where the government is thinking about all the property as its endowment. Now, it does have to give private property out because some form of property, some people are going to want to have a house or an apartment building, and we've got to give a good way to get that thing. Other people are going to want to have a mosque or a synagogue or a church or some other sort of temple for religion. And people have to be free to use that. We can't say, okay, mosques are no good, but churches and synagogues, those are okay. We can't have any rules like that. But we also have to, but something that's real that really does affect each other. We can say you can have this factory that doesn't pollute and this factory that pollutes a little if you pay for that, but you can't have this other factory that pollutes by releasing cyanide into the water because that's going to kill people. So those things, if it really affects other people, they can discriminate on those bases, but not on these irrelevant factors like what is the project that the individual is pursuing with their property. Then but the government is also going to have to defend public spaces. We need a lot more public spaces and a much bigger set of nature reserves. It's very clear that we don't have enough nature left in the world. We've privatized too much of it, and we're killing the very environment that sustains us. So we need more taxes on pollution and much bigger parks and much bigger nature reserves and other sorts of public spaces. But the exact mix is an outcome of that political process. It depends somewhat on just what people want. And there's different preferences. People might, I'd like to have a park right down here. Somebody else wouldn't want a park there. They'd want it somewhere else. And the rules for using the park, that's going to vary by people's preferences. But this idea, so there's, and it's going to depend also about what is good for people, what is good in the long run, what's going to be good for our descendants, and what is good for the disadvantaged people who, as much as we try to bring them in, we end up effectively shutting them out because we're imperfect. We have to take these things into account, but there's a lot of variables and no one's going to know what's going to come out of this process. But I think that is how we look at it. A negotiation between a government maximizing the true value of the people's endowment and us as individuals wanting to buy or rent property from that government.
Yeah, and so you mentioned the environmental externality, which I agree is massive, but to some extent, our lifestyle very much would depend upon sort of like a maximum consumption attitude, and we've seen that. I mean, especially right prior to the pandemic, where people from you could call them the globalists, right? People who like management consultants or professors, academics like us, who go or graduate students who go on to conferences and fly on airplanes, very far away. So yeah, I mean, who's going to address this environmental externality? I mean, it seems to me you suggest that it would be the government which would have to, regulate and, make the, taking an airplane super expensive or making the car purchases expensive. So, but then, if you push it to the government, well, I mean, the government is run by officials, and they are being elected by the people. So there's still some collective responsibility that exists, right, with respect to addressing things like environmental degradation, right?
Yes, I think I can give a really short answer to that. Yes.
Yeah.
What elaborations I would add.
Okay. Okay.
Unless if you want to get more specific, you can. But
yeah. I mean, it's just a practical matter of like that's going to be difficult to do. Okay, so I have so with respect to the book, there's one question I have about inequality that was in my mind, which is what is ideal inequality? And I preface this by citing a study by Tony Atkinson. He's now deceased, but he was I think the most famous British economist and expert on inequality. And in his book, he starts it off by asking, well, what is the ideal level of inequality? And his one sentence reply is less than presently. And like while I would agree with that sentiment, I think it's very much it still leaves a lot of questions open, right? Because you're going to dispute whether the genie has to come down by 0.01 or it has to come down by 0.1 and things like that. So, but yet, I mean, it seems to be like in your book, I think that's sort of the not the question that you're asking in the book, but sort of that's lurking beyond it. So do you have a take on this you could say philosophical discussion of ideal levels of inequality?
Well, the ideal level of inequality would be, if it was possible, the amount of inequality that the least advantaged people agree to. Say, okay, you're going to take all these resources and do stuff with them in your own interest. Okay, how much are you going to pay me for the fact that you're interfering with all the uses I can make of that? That's what property is. It's a way to settling dispute. People want to use resources differently.
Yeah.
So let me take an example. Okay, say several people get shipwrecked on an island, so nobody owns it. Nobody owns the island, and there's good land there for everybody, but it needs a well. We need a well, one well that everybody's going to use. The way now, how we decide who digs the well and what we do with the property around the well, and whether we have farming and other things on the island. But what are we going to do? How are we going to dig this well? The way most societies have done this is to say, okay, the rich guy, well, Mr. Howell, is going to own the land where the well is going to be. Or he's going to own, or him and people like him are going to own all the land. And then you won't have any access to resources, so you'll dig the well, but he'll own it, and he'll get whatever. Then he'll sell the water to us, and he'll get back a lot of the wages. He and people like him will get back the wages that they pay us to do this. So he gets everything. That's how we really do it. Now, one solution which people associate with a version of communism, or even would be, okay, we're all going to, maybe even Rawlsianism, is to have complete equality and say, well, we will all work together to build this well, and we will divide everything up equally. That's fine if people want to do that. But suppose there's this guy, Mr. House, says, look, I'll dig it all by myself. Okay, I want to have more land than everybody else.
Yeah.
I will dig the well all by myself. And then in exchange, you'll give me bigger land. You'll give me more land than everybody gets. And I'll get to be this big landowner, at least for some time. Maybe that's only going to be enough to rent the land for a certain amount of time or something. Now, because it has to be revisable because of future generations and people who didn't realize what they were getting into. So Mr. Howell digs the well.
Yeah.
Then he gets property. And if everybody else agrees to that, that's a perfectly good arrangement. If all of the people who have to do with less, so Mr. Howell can have more, say, look, Mr. Howell has provided a service for us. This is worth the trade-off. We agree to it when we could have agreed we could have done otherwise. Then that's a fine level of inequality. However, that will never happen. Well, it might happen in a really small society. That will never happen in a big, complex society. When you've got all these people doing these different things, the idea is the privileged people are really working to get the resources. But then you're going to price it wrong. Well, not necessarily wrong. People in the group that is effectively selling property are going to disagree about, well, what should be the regulations on this well? How much property should Mr. Howell get on this well, and what does that do to whatever I have left? They're going to disagree about this. So, because of that, you got to realize they could be right and the majority could be wrong, or the majority could be right and they can be wrong. You don't know, but this person is going to be the most disadvantaged, and that's why you've got to really get the most you can get out of this Mr. Howell in order to make sure that you're compensating these objectors, these dissenters, as I call them. You're compensating them as much as possible for the fact that we force these rules on you that you might not have agreed to. Now, people say, oh, well, there's some simple basic rules that we will all agree to. No, they're not. I mean, maybe there are, sure. Nobody should murder. Great. That's a good one. But how you enforce that rule of murder are not going to be equal. And how you dole out property is not going to be entirely fair. You're going to make mistakes. Even if there's a true justice out there, nobody understands what it is. So nobody really has a handle on what is perfect justice. So I don't say that justice as the pursuit of accord reaches true justice. It is a strategy for being as just as we can under the impossible circumstances we live with, where we don't really understand justice enough to be fair to everybody, where we have systemic self-interest bias, and we don't really understand the situation of others who object to it. So justice the pursuit of accord is a strategy for dealing with the fact that we need to create rules in a society where we are incapable of making them just.
It's an interesting point because, so I mean, I'm in the subfield in sociology of labor, and so the big phenomenon that we look into is the gig economy, right? So like Uber and other kinds of online services And also the fact that we spend more and more time on social media, on Twitter and Facebook, etc. All of these activities not being remunerated, and as a way to deal with that sort of injustice, one of the solutions that a guy named Jaron Lanier talks about is micropayments, right? So it's this idea that however much money was generated on social media by us clicking through YouTube videos or Facebook links, you would pay the users, like a whatever fraction of the revenues that are generated by selling blocks of advertisement to third parties. And so I think while that sort of market-driven mechanism sounds very attractive, I would find it very questionable, in practice, because as you say, we live in a complex society, and how would you calculate the fair share that somebody would be getting for for looking through Google and Facebook products, and it would make more sense to just pay a UBI, where you say, okay, well, it doesn't really matter how much you actually contributed to the output. So that's just to support your point here. So yeah, I think that covers it really well. I would maybe let's conclude on some ideas about where the UBI movement is headed at the moment. I mean, are there promising examples perhaps of where you think that we can bring the cause of UBI forward the most? I mean, we had obviously the Andrew Yang campaign here, but yeah, do you have any thoughts about the practical, pointers about where the movement is going?
Yes. I can say that the UBI movement is heading for black swans. And a black swan is an unpredictable event. We don't know when they're going to happen, what they're going to be. A black swan could be in the direction of promoting basic income, and it could be one that's going to be harmful to basic income. Now, the coronavirus was, well, Andrew Yang and the coronavirus were both black swans. There were other things that were more predictable. It was predictable that in the Great Recession in 2008 and the turning of people's attention to inequality was going to be good for the UBI movement. That was an easy one. Was Andrew Yang going to come along and spend 2 years promoting basic income and make this big splash and get all these other people interested in basic income and giving a boost to all the activists who have been doing basic income? No one could predict that. I mean, Andrew Yang maybe predicted it, but he has self-serving bias and wishful thinking. So people couldn't, he's a great guy, but we all suffer from these things. He couldn't predict it. That was a black swan. Then he dropped down. And I even wrote an article, now is the time for the Yang gang to look at, what their long-term goals are, and do they want to create a UBI movement and something, and because attention is going down, attention to UBI is going down. But then this black swan hit of coronavirus, and suddenly everybody is talking about basic income as a temporary basic income as a way to get us through this crisis. And it looks like some countries are actually going to do something like a basic income. The U.S. government didn't, and a lot of countries aren't. But that really boosted basic income. Now, the underlying problems in the society that have made basic income from where it was 15 years ago to where it is now, these underlying problems are not going away. That is that we have an enormously unequal society, we have enormous poverty, and the conditional approach to poverty has not delivered. It hasn't eliminated poverty, and it hasn't proved by making the poor jump through hoops and prove that they're worthy. It hasn't made them invulnerable to to vilification or to enormous cuts. We've had enormous cuts in the conditional system almost all over the world in the last 50 years, when making the poor prove that they're deserving poor was supposed to make it everybody want to give. The conditional system hasn't worked. It hasn't delivered the promise that that FDR gave us in the New Deal, or that Bismarck gave us in the 1880s with the first German reforms. It hasn't delivered. Inequality is getting worse. These underlying problems are going to continue to happen. That looks good for the future of the basic income movement. But black swans are out there, things we can't predict, which could be good and bad for basic income. And we don't know what those are. I would say the biggest threat right now to basic income is economic nationalism. Well, really all forms of nationalism. We elected a national, and that's a big trend in the world right now.
Mm-hmm.
The United States electors from the Electoral College elected a nationalist leader who is, and many other countries, Bolsonaro in Brazil, to some extent, Boris Johnson in Britain, Narendra Modi in India, so many others. All these nationalist leaders who are telling you, your problem, you, the disadvantaged people in my country, your problem isn't the rich in your country. No, it is the foreigner and the poor person. Those people are causing all your problems. Let's get them. The foreigner, the poor person, the black person, the Native American. These outgroups, they're the cause of your problem. So what they're doing is they're getting like the middle class to blame the least advantaged people for all their problems. And now look at who's benefiting from your problems. Those are the people that you need to be taxing, not and looking against this nationalism where they say, as soon as we defeat these people, we treat them worse, you're going to get better. And they never deliver on it. They just end up treating these foreigners and poor people in foreigners, immigrants, and poor people and outgroups. They treat them worse and seldom deliver for the people they say that they're for. I mean, nationalist leaders have a horrible record. People like Mussolini and Hitler were nationalist leaders. They didn't do a damn bit of good for their people. Got them into pointless wars that made everybody in the country worse off, including Mussolini and Hitler themselves.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a very good point here. I mean, I recently read this book by Thomas Childers, a historian on Nazi Germany, and he depicted, I mean, how, so some of the rank and file within the Nazi movement in the 20s were extremely, you could say, socialist in their orientation, because they wanted to get the working class vote. Steal that from the Communist Party and the Socialist Party. But Hitler himself, he wasn't too friendly to the socialist rhetoric. He only appealed to socialism as much as necessary, but not much more, because he wanted to get the industrialist support, the ThyssenKrupp, the defense production industry, and those industrialists, like, they were not enthusiastic Nazis, you could tell. In fact, I mean, many of them are kind of open-minded. I mean, you could think of like the Jared Kushner types, the like New York liberal elite. But they were willing to sign on to the nationalist agenda because they thought that, like, communism would be even worse, essentially, right?
Yeah. Well, Hitler was a dumbass who made all sorts of just obvious mistakes in what he did. He was borderline incompetent, but he did outsmart all of those people. There were people who tried to use him, and the Nazi Party, the industrialists who wanted the benefits of government taxing them very little and buying all the stuff that they made for Hitler's projects. He bought stuff from Porsche. He bought stuff from Bayer Aspirin. He's bought some of the tanks were made by Porsche. Hugo Boss, the great designer, sold the Nazis their uniforms. And those people, although, look, we're making money hand over fist for this, but another group he outsmarted was the military. the military, the traditional military, and that a lot of them were not Nazis and were not really very sympathetic to Nazis. But they're like, well, this is good for us. He's building up the military. And what he outsmarted them in several ways. One was by taking full power. And shortly after his coalition took sort of democratic power in Parliament. He then used a technicality in the German Constitution that allowed him to take full power, and he never released it. So all of these people were kind of stuck with him, and he made it really dangerous for either the military or the industrialists or really anybody else to oppose him. Then he led them into war, which in the military, like, well, we'll get behind him because we're at war now. And okay, yeah, Hitler has these problems, but our big problem is Russia, France, and England want to kill us. So we'll just follow Hitler. He totally outsmarted them, and they all paid the price for it. They had their cities bombed. They had houses of theirs destroyed. Many of their, if they weren't killed, many of their friends and relatives were killed. He totally outsmarted them, and then was a dumbass.
Well, I mean, just as a biographical asterisk here, I mean, Hitler was sort of like a vagabond for the first 25 years of his life, because I mean, like his father was like a civil servant in the Austrian government, so he got a little bit of an alimony payment, but he was sort of like a hobo in Vienna because he was rejected from the art school where he applied to, and it was only when World War I started, and at that point he was living in Munich, in Germany, and when he joined the German army as an Austrian citizen, interestingly, but he still fought for the German army. Yeah. And it was only then that he sort of got his, you could say, his the Berufung, or calling, right? He received this calling, to dominate, through the military. I guess it really impressed him that he could use the German armor to make Germany great again. Which is an old saying.
And he is, he was, his path to power, it was very much like Trump without the money. Now, I'm not saying Trump is just like Hitler. Trump has not seized. He's not used the military to seize full power the way he did. So he's not leading us down that utterly self-destructive path. He's done a lot of things I disagree with, but not like Nazi-like things. But their rise to power was similar in the sense that they both said a lot of incoherent nationalist crap that people just ate up because they delivered it in a way that people of a certain feeling ate up, and but at least Trump, they said, look at me, I'm really successful. I got a lot of money. I'm so successful. He had a track record to run on, plus all this bluster and all these self-contradictory theories and stuff. But Hitler had this just incoherent book, Mein Kampf, and a bunch of really powerful speeches, but based on somebody who had been homeless before the war and really had no track record of success whatsoever, except for getting people to believe his bullshit.
Yeah, but I guess the crucial point here is the volatile political economy that they were facing in 1930s in Germany, and that almost 100 years later, I mean, we're sort of seeing these challenges again, right? There's sort of like this anti-globalist sentiment. I mean, I saw, I think the headline yesterday was that Trump was canceling the H-1B visas, which is, I guess, new H-1B recipients. And I mean, you could imagine that this policy is really hurting people in our class. I mean, sort of like the higher skilled people, and those in universities. But And then if you're sort of like a less educated and more disadvantaged voter, and you say, well, why should I care about H-1B? It's like if Trump says, he wants to take care of American citizens, he wants to make sure that, American jobs for American people. That sounds like an idea that I could get behind, right? Um, except that even if you are like anti-immigrant, I mean, all it does is, it makes the economy somewhat less prosperous, and then with that, there's going to be less jobs overall, right? So even if you realize nationalist agenda, I mean, there isn't necessarily going to be the benefit for the people that put the nationalists in charge, right?
Yeah, well, because nationalism doesn't work. It's not only that they don't deliver to the people, but their formula of how to deliver for the nation is wrong. You deliver for the nation by America first or Germany first. We're going to put down the other guys and put up you guys. It doesn't work. It's the world is not an us and them situation. It is not a zero-sum game. That's why one of the things I really liked about Andrew Yang was this idea of humanity first. That's what works is not thinking about, if you help the blacks, you hurt the whites. Or if you help the blacks, you hurt the police. That's not the way it works. If you get a really good system, it works for whoever is enforcing the laws, as well as the blacks and the whites and the Native Americans and all these other groups. Our international relations, if we look at what's good for China and good for the United States and good for Japan and good for the United States and our trading relations, that's better for everyone. The nationalists trying to put other people down ends up not putting themselves up. You can have a few people benefit from that, but you can't get a whole nation benefiting from that. So nationalism, it just doesn't work, but people keep trying it. And one of the things that you mentioned is a big reason for it is when people lose faith in democracy. There's a lot of people are losing faith in democracy around the world, and this is the most dangerous trend that, other than the fact that we're killing the environments that sustains us, that's probably the most dangerous trend. But the second one is this decline in belief in democracy. Our problems flow from not having had enough democracy, not from having too much of it. If you end democracy, you will always get a government that is at war with its people. Some of them are more benevolent than others, but all of them have that aspect. They have to put down resistance. What happened in the Weimar Republic that preceded Hitler is that the Weimar Republic agreed to this horrible treaty at the end of World War I that gave war debts to Germany, designed to knock Germany down, designed to make them a poor country. And it was having that effect throughout the Weimar period that ended when Hitler took power in 1933. And one of the things that brought it about was by that period, this is the first democracy, much closer to democracy than the earlier versions of it. The closest thing to democracy Germany ever had.
Yeah.
And it's not working. So Germans were giving up on democracy in the Weimar Republic 2 or 3 years before Hitler came to power. Some bad authoritarian was very likely to take power. They would have been better if it had been pretty much anybody but Hitler. But they got Hitler. And that's what we're vulnerable to in the world today. Somebody who's a lot worse than Trump and Modi could come along in various countries around the world. Now, I didn't even mention Putin as our nationalist leaders, and run us down a horrible path.
Yeah, so I guess an important point that somebody like, I think Francis Fukuyama is raising, I mean, he of course became really famous with this grand prediction about the victory of liberal democracy. And then part of the reason why, of course, the evidence over the last 30 years has made him much more cautious is that, I mean, he talks about the importance of building these, liberal democratic institutions as well, right? And if you don't, and if you don't build those sufficiently, then you're going to have a devolution into kind of like a warlike situation. Um, but yeah, so these are very scary times to be in. But but I think that's what, to bring it back to the basic income movement. I think that's what makes our contribution even more important, right? Because you know, because so when there's a critique of the capitalist system, right? As it it has to occur because of the inequality that it produces, right? Then you say, well, we can't necessarily go to its socialism because it didn't have the positive track record economically and human rights, etc. So then, what is the what is another path to its improvement that we could go towards? And I mean, I would think it. I mean, aside from UBI, I mean, I don't really, and of course, good public services like healthcare and education system, etc. I mean, I don't really have that alternative vision, right? I mean, do you have some thoughts on that?
As we have so many troublesome trends. We've got troublesome trends of the growth of nationalism, and the people who are trying to establish greater and greater inequality, and we have the killing of the environment that sustains us, which is not just global warming. There's so many things out there that are worse than global warming. And global warming is just as bad as they say, and other things are worse, like the acidification of the ocean, and Fukushima, which is still spewing out radiation into the oceans 10 years later. The loss of habitat and the pollution of our water and our air with all sorts of toxins. All of those are, I think, a greater threat to life on Earth than global warming. Now, so we have all these troublesome trends, but we also have other trends in the other way, is that people are fighting for greater equality and for greater democracy and for improving the environment and other things. And for things like this new protest movement that has grown up since the George Floyd murder has been a wonderful thing. Mm-hmm. And it's not just in the U.S. There's all these countries that have gotten on with it. Some to support us, but some for similar issues in their countries. And there's a lot of ways that these things could go. These different things are interacting, mm-hmm. and we shouldn't be solving these problems violently. We should be solving them by negotiation and democracy. Mm-hmm. But there's people pushing in good directions, and there's so many ways we could go. I think the momentum is to say, look, we've tried this conditional model, and it hasn't worked. Let's move to the universal model with universal basic income. That, I think, is the best thing. But if all we did was rebuild Lyndon Johnson's welfare state that we had in the 1960s in the U.S., or we rebuilt, or we went to, say, the much more generous conditional system that Sweden had in the 1960s and 70s before all these cuts started, that would improve a lot of people's lives. Not as much as I think a good basic income economy, basic income combined with good public services would do. But that would be a good way. We might move towards more general conditional programs. We might move towards more universality. But either of those would be steps in the right direction. The problem in the world today is that the disadvantaged people are unfree because they have so little. And anything that helps to reverse that is a step in the right direction.
Very much is true. I mean, so just one last point. I think you mentioned nuclear energy just in passing.
Yeah.
I mean, so I have some neoliberal friends who argue that nuclear energy is a savior with respect to climate change, and the assumption being that it doesn't output CO2, right? I mean, my response would be with respect to the waste that's produced and you're not able to store it. and also the possibility that you can have a Fukushima-like disaster. But do you have any opinions about energy future and how we should plan that?
This is one thing that I strongly disagree with Andrew Yang on. He supported nuclear energy, and he supported nuclear energy, and I think that's an enormous mistake. I think nuclear energy, it's almost good as solar and wind power. It's really just as good for the environment as solar and wind power, if you, and because you can make it, we have technology that can build lots and lots of them and produce lots of energy. It is the best solution to the energy issue, the most environmental solution to the energy issue, if you just ignore one thing. And that one thing is Murphy's Law, which in Britain is called Sod's Law. I don't know, maybe they don't want to give Irish people any credit. I don't know why it's that's over there. Murphy's Law, anything that can go wrong will go wrong.
Mm-hmm.
Sure, they say, look, the things that have happened with nuclear power, the accidents we've had over the last 50 years have killed a lot less people than the accidents we've had with coal. And it hasn't produced all that pollution that coal does. Yeah, but we've had some really screwed up things. We don't know how many fish Fukushima is going to kill. 10 years later, we don't know. It's killing more and more sea life every day. If we kill the oceans, everyone dies. All of the land animals will die if we kill the oceans by spewing radiation into them. We don't know where this is going to end. That's just Fukushima alone. The Chernobyl disaster was very close to killing everyone in a large swath of Eastern Europe, across what's now several countries, and parts of what he was then was several countries. It killed reindeer in Lapland, in the northern Scandinavia, because that's where the cloud went. It killed a bunch of reindeer up there. All of these things could happen. We don't need to take this bigger risk. Oh, we have these new ones that are much, much safer than Fukushima and Chernobyl. Yes, they have. Yeah, you're not going to repeat the oldest mistakes, but as Jeff Goldblum says, you're not repeating the same mistakes. You're making all new ones. We will do something wrong. We will screw this up, and sooner or later, we're going to have the kind of disaster that Chernobyl could have been. Or something like Fukushima is just uncontrollably good, not to mention the nuclear waste that we cannot store safely and still to this day don't know what to do with. So when we have alternatives, such as solar, wind power, water energy, we have these cleaner alternatives. We don't need this. We also can figure out, well, how can we just use less? How can we use less fossil fuels, just use less energy across the board? How can we get more bang for a buck? I said, I have to tell you, this is an interesting fact I ran across the other day. You know where the phrase bang for the buck comes from?
No.
It was invented by the Eisenhower administration to justify focusing on building nuclear weapons rather than conventional weapons, because they give you a bigger bang for the buck.
Take a bang for the buck. Okay.
So if we can reduce the energy we use for other things, it's just, I don't think nuclear power is necessary to move us out of things that are killing our environment the way most fossil fuels are. Yes, nuclear energy might not kill the environment. If nothing goes wrong, it won't kill the environment, but it could kill the environment much more effectively than coal or gas. Gas would. It kills it. It could kill it much more effectively, and you can't prove that you'll never make those mistakes. And if you make that mistake, you could kill every last thing. Really, the only threat to the environment that could kill every last living being on this earth is nuclear radiation.
Exactly. Yeah.
Now, but when we have these other things that we can use, we need to go to those things.
Yeah, I mean, one of the like criticisms against the sort of alternative energy movement, like especially with solar and wind power, I mean, it's not that it would be bad for the environment per se, but rather that it's too small, right? So the fact that, I mean, you invest into these energy sources and it still covers, I don't know, less than 10% in a lot of countries of the energy needs. So I would think that the last solution that you proposed, which is to reduce energy usage and energy consumption, I think that would probably be the most effective route to preserve the planet.
I I don't know. I don't know what is the most effective. That might be, but I think a large reason that we haven't we haven't done much with solar power yet is we simply haven't invested enough with it. What if every single house in the United States had a roof made out of solar panels? What if sidewalks and roads were made out of solar panels? We could raise a lot of energy doing that if we really put our efforts into these alternative fuels. I saw something the other day on using just streams, an environmental friendly way to use the energy of streams to turn a turbine and generate electricity. There's so many things out there that we haven't really invested in. Now, I'm not an expert on this. That's my feeling, but I just know we got to, whether it's a combination of reduction of energy use or a buildup of alternative fuels that aren't going to kill the planet, we've got to move in this direction. Nuclear power is at best stopgap to help us through that transition, and I think it's one we could skip, and it's just too dangerous. We should skip it.
Yeah, I think one of my broader concerns is this idea of like a limitless world, right? This idea that we can always grow. We can add more to GDP, and we can, have a growing population, and we can sustain everybody easily. And I mean, so I mean, as mainstream economists, I mean, we could sort of trash the Malthusian ideas, right? That because we can easily sustain a growing population, we have more than enough food for everybody, and that's all true. But I think that one of the concerns is that Malthusianism could come back to haunt us in a planet which does have limits, right? Fixed physical limits. I mean, like how much fresh water you can have. I mean, how much rubber or metals and things like that. And I'm worried that our system just cannot deal with this idea of physical limits. I mean, maybe the only way out of it is the way how Elon Musk or Jeff Bezos portray it, which is we should conquer space. We should create a Star Trek world. And I mean, in that case, I think then I think the taps are off on economic growth, and there's nothing wrong with having trillions of human beings alive, which is what Bezos said he wanted. But assuming that this would be megalomania, I mean, what's your take on this idea of a limited world?
The theory that is the opposite of environmentalism is a little known theory that's called Cornucopia Nism.
Yeah.
And it's really a simple idea that that our resources are limited, but our ideas are unlimited. And we can always come up with new ways to get more out of our resources. And I think to some extent that is true. So one example might be in the 70s, people were worried about running out of oil. Mm-hmm. And the cornucopian would say, look, okay, we run out of oil. No big deal. We'll figure out something else next. We'll figure out a better way to use coal or nuclear or solar or something. This was good for us. Oil was good for us for this period. And when it doesn't work, we have something else. Now, for something like, and it turns out the problem with oil is not running out. The problem is using too much of it.
Yeah.
Now, there was some, I'm not sure that you could have kickstarted the Industrial Revolution or done the second phase of the Industrial Revolution from 1850 to 1950. I'm not sure you could have done that without using some oil and gas. Some oil, natural gas, and coal. So and depleting those and never replenishing them was not necessarily a bad thing, but it's simply cornucopianism can't apply to everything. We only have one environment. We only have one atmosphere. We only have one big ocean that goes over the whole planet. If we kill the environment that sustains us, we don't have anything to replace it. We'd have to create a biosphere in space or something. My grandfather was a farmer in the early 20th century.
Mm-hmm.
He was born in the 1890s.
Mm-hmm.
And he was a farmer for a lot of years who raised sheep and grew vegetables and stuff. And he retired from most farming by the 1950s because of the fertilizers that everybody had to use fertilizers then. And all farmers were organic farmers before about the 1950s. And he quit from that because he believed this was killing people. The crap that they're putting in our food was going to kill people, and that this was unsustainable. And this was a belief at the time. He was a conservative Republican. That was conservatism, is that you cannot take more from the land than you give back to the land. Now, that might be true for some rare things like coal and oil that are ultimately replaceable, and we really shouldn't be using too much of them anyway. But it's not true. It might not be true of everything, and it's not true of the environment. So we've got to, if we're gonna deplete the land, we have to replenish the land. And early farmers knew this, and contemporary farmers who have to do whatever the big agribusiness companies like Monsanto want, they've forgotten it or have to pretend they don't know. And we're not even eating things made from the soil anymore. What we do is we have depleted the soil over most of the country, and what we do is we fertilize the soil. We fertilize the soil every year instead of so the soil that really is horrible for growing things. We've already destroyed it. We put soil in every year that's made up of these chemicals that Monsanto and other companies are selling people, and we're eating food that has grown out of those chemicals. Our food is. You are what you eat, and you are what your food eats. And our food eats utter crap.
Yeah.
So we're growing food with all of this, with just making it out of chemicals. So that the food is much less nutritious than it was in 1950. Then we are feeding this crap to our animals, and even feeding them the wrong crap. Animals that are supposed to eat grass, we're forcing them to eat corn or wheat. And we have to give them antacids so they can digest this. So we're getting a meat that has horrible nutrition, and we're getting meat, and we're getting meat that has antacids and all this other stuff to try to keep it healthy enough to stay alive until we slaughter it. That's what we're eating. We can't do this. We've got to find sustainable farming. It was great that we were able to increase farm output, but we can't do it sustainably. We're just killing ourselves.
And there's no way around it. It seems to be over the short term, because I mean, when your grandfather was alive, I mean, perhaps the U.S. population was maybe 1/3 of what we have today, and then of course, if you look at globally, we're probably like 4 or 5 times larger, right? So, I mean, it isn't the issue that perhaps with this process of industrialization, which you described as enclosure and colonialism, we jump-started a process that is not only delivering us less returns, but actually starting to deliver us negative returns, and we have to figure a way to stop that engine. make it operate differently?
I don't think overpopulation is the problem. That's what everybody thought the environment was being the environmental problems were being driven by overpopulation in the 1960s. The environmental problem was the overpopulation problem.